This conference will now be recorded.
Ta-da! It is now time for the Got-IT talks this Wednesday. I am so fortunate that I'm joined today by Lex van Velsen from the Research Institute, and today to talk about actually the core of the Got-IT project. In a way, we're also going to talk a little bit, I suppose, about digital development in a more general sense, the why of the Got-IT talks, I suppose. Um, but to those of you that have watched more than one of these Got-IT talks, as we all know, it's very important, of course, to know who you're actually listening to, looking at. So, Lex, you're of course leading this Got-IT project, but why, if you will, or what's the story about how you came to work with something as fascinating as digital development?
hmm
Uh,
Wow, me personally, you mean? Um,
you personally, indeed.
yeah,
Uh,
it's
what
been a
brings
long
what
road.
brings a human being to work with digital development?
That's a good question. It's a very fundamental one too, as well. So
Mm.
maybe I should go back a bit in time. So I'm from the Netherlands, and I originally I started technical communication there. This was a while ago. I think I completed that in about 2003. And then afterwards, I decided to at one point do a PhD in user-centered design of new services, digital services in that case. So I did the PhD, and then after that, I ended up in e-health development because I did a postdoc at the Dutch National Institute for Public Health. So the people that are now having to deal with this whole Corona thing. I left in time, I think. So then I went to Roesing Research and Development, or RRD in short, and there I worked further on this technical development. And I think that this is what interests me the most. So the whole process from A to Z, where you in the beginning have nothing or a good idea. You can hope so. And then you start to define what you should make, and then you refine your ideas, and then at one point you start to develop actual things. And we are very fortunate to have, both the designers in house at RD as well as the developers and the people that can do the actual implementation. So it's really fascinating for me to see the whole process and to learn along the way as well, because it's always a learning experience. You start with an idea and you think, oh, this is what the world looks like and this is what we're going to do. And then at one point you figure out that, well, some of your ideas were correct and some were totally wrong. And that's where you have to you are confronted with yourself and you have to innovate. So that's interesting and a learning experience too. So that's the whole technology development background, I think. Yeah.
Is that then maybe sort of like does this have an artistic element to it, or is more like being an architect, a bit the building part of it? That it's sort
hmm
of
I
or
think
both, maybe?
I think it's multifaceted. So developing these type of interventions. So 100% sure there's a creative element involved, I think, and that's what I really cherish to try new things and to see whether they work or not. There's also a technical element, and then there's the clinical element that's involved, and the legal part, and so it's a lot of different things that come together in eHealth, and that you somehow have to merge.
Mm,
And quite often they do not always align with each other, but that's what makes it interesting, and that's where the creativity also plays a role. Aligning all these different interests and
mm,
aspects. Yeah.
mm, yeah, but of course, I guess it's a sort of a given, almost a rhetorical question. Obviously, your work, your organization has been affected by Corona, but while that is obvious, could you also, in your view, what has been the prime elements that have shifted then as a result of well, the last 1.5 years?
Hmm. I think that the whole attitude towards e-health has changed in healthcare. Some at one point there was this necessity, people couldn't go to the
Mm.
hospital, they couldn't go to their physical therapist, they couldn't just go to their GP. So we had to find other means. And well, one of the easiest things to do was to use eHealth and to use, for example, video conferencing and to monitor people via distance. So I
Mm.
think that a really big attitude change. So you see a lot of new initiatives being embraced, while previously the reality was that a lot of people in practice were quite skeptical or maybe a bit hesitant, but there was no choice. So this changed. That's one of the positive things that came out of this whole situation, I think.
Mm. Sort of for you, you see that as uh, just skipping a few steps of an evolution that would have happened anyway, or uh, did you experience this as sort of a fundamental shift in paradigms?
Hmm. I think it's inevitable that we went there. You see the popping up of Fitbits, smartwatches, stuff like that.
Mm.
So one way or the other, we're going towards a situation in which primary care centers, hospitals get a totally different role. Society, maybe they even close for a part in a few decades' time. This is a bit a
Mm.
risky uh, statement, but okay. I think it's where we are heading. We're not going to have people come to their specialist to ask how they are going every 6 months or every 12 months just because that's what we do. No, if things are going well, why go to the doctor if you can indicate this digitally? And it's also the case that if things are not going well, you can pick up earlier digitally, and then you could schedule in an extra appointment. So I think there's going to be a big shift from standard protocols and doing things like we've always done to a situation in which the patient and the technology dictates what the interaction will be. And that probably means less hospitalizations, less appointments. So maybe a smaller hospital or one focused on operations primarily.
Um, so specifically though, to ask the question and then about, I guess, when these things are then made, generated, um, it's time to also then talk about quality,
Mm-hmm.
um, talk about maybe user needs, talk alignment of, well, budget,
Mm-hmm.
literacy, user needs, and so on. I'm hinting, trying to hint towards a specific guideline.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as far as I remember, I suppose that somewhere in within RD, this idea was born. Um, of course, in the story of humans, this is not the first guideline to be ever
Mm-hmm.
made. But still, what was? Can you sort of give us a story? When was there a
Mm-hmm.
specific meeting or time where that this guideline? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I know sometimes innovations of this nature comes from a aha situation where it said, "Oh, it was a shame that we didn't have so and so," and then 2 seconds later you think,
Mm-hmm.
"Well, we got to build it then." Was this one of those situations, or?
I think credit due where credit due. So the idea was not mine to develop the Got-IT toolkit and to develop guidelines for e-health literacy. So my former colleague Miriam Cabrita, she came up with the idea to develop. a guideline and a toolkit like this. I don't think it was just the snap of a moment. I think these ideas evolved for a long time. So at RD, we've been doing digital development processes for older adults for quite a while now. So I've been working on the topic of frailty, falls prevention, supporting people in mental health issues at an older age. So there are a lot of projects in which we conducted with the elderly. And then you of course see it as a recurring theme that it's of course a given. Everybody could think, it should be simple for older adults and it should be simple to read text so that everybody with different educational levels or literacy skills can read a text and can use a service with the same quality or output. But then you have to do it at one point. It's easier said than done. How do you create an easy text? How do you create an easy visualization? I'm a scientist, and we just love charts, line charts to show all these developments over time and evolutions. And
everybody understands them, of
of
course,
course, with six
every
lines
time.
and different axes, and then different axes in the same graph with different lines, we love them. But that's a big bias that people like scientists have, that we like this type of information. But in order to make something that everybody understands, you should be able to, stand in the other person's shoes and look at these types of visualizations like a person would with lower literacy. That's quite difficult, actually. If you ask me, how should I present this information not in a line graph? That's actually quite a difficult question. All these things are in line graphs. If you have a Fitbit, they show the progress in line graphs, that type of stuff. So how do you create an easy visualization? Not an easy question. But it's something that we need in order to make these projects more successful and to have adoption on a bigger scale. So I think that's where the idea came from.
How
And
does that idea then differentiate? I mean, there's for a long time, I guess, from the early stages of the internet, usability, figuring out good UIs have been something that, and for those listeners out there that might be wondering, I mean, user interface, but abbreviated a UI. I guess one of the other quirks of the digital age is surviving acronyms. But that's been something that's, of course, been a field for quite some time. Is how does this sort of um, differ from the traditional
yeah,
talk about that?
yeah. So of course you have things like usability, accessibility as well. That's maybe a bit closer related to this specific context. So usability is mainly about getting a task done on a website, for example, effectively, efficiently, and to satisfaction, according to the ISO definition. I think that if you focus on ELT literacy, it's more on a detailed level, more specific for a group. There are lots of people that do not have the reading skills that developers have, and I think that in the Netherlands we have 17 million inhabitants, of which 1 million have low or no literacy, so they can't read or write, or at a very low level. So that's an interesting and very challenging group to design for. And you can make something usable, but still it wouldn't be usable to them because they require this extra level. I always compare this to a pyramid. So if you want to have a very good application, you have to ensure that one, it's working technically. Of course, it's the basic level. Then above that, you have the usability. And then above that, then you get your different steps specific for this application. So if you make an ELT application, which is normally should serve a very large population, including people with low ELT literacy, then you should also counter for these upper levels of the pyramid. and for that you need specific guidelines because they
Mm.
have these specific requirements. And if you then go searching, then there are quite some guidelines for usability, like the Nielsen heuristics. There are guidelines for accessibility, even very long and very specific guidelines. And partly these accessibility guidelines also apply to e-health literacy, but a very specific set of guidelines for e-health literacy, that's not really out there. And I think this is a niche that's interesting, not just for RRD, but for the e-health development community in general. So that's where the idea was born. And so the goal of the Got-IT Toolkit, because I assume that's where you want me to go, is to.
Well, just but one question before we go to that particular
Sure.
one. Is that maybe also, I mean, you would probably, of course, be also familiar with the good old idea, and you were the one who mentioned the pyramid, the good old idea about Maslowian needs. Is this also then just a sort of a mirroring where we are at in digital
Mhm.
development? That the first requirement was sort of the technical capability being
Mhm.
possible at all, and
Mhm.
later on, then you could add extra elements. But nowadays, we're coming to a level where, I mean, it's not enough that that you can actually reach the
Yeah.
website for that. It actually has to work, and it has
Mhm.
to actually be, and so on. So it's also a mirror of where we are at the evolution of e-health in general.
Definitely. I think we're really evolving as a field. So in the beginning, we would be happy with a website, then a
Mm,
usable website, and now we want to have a website that doesn't infringe upon our privacy. Um,
mm,
and then at one point, you also want to make sure that it's usable for people with all different levels of literacy. So yeah, I think it's a
mm.
part of the evolution. Yeah, correct.
Yeah, but this then fits perfectly with the purpose. Then explain to well me, but our listeners or viewers later
Hmm.
on the purpose really then of the Got It Toolkit
Hmm.
as you see it.
Yeah, I think that the Gothic toolkit serves different goals. So one, creating awareness among developers of e-health intervention that there is such a thing as e-health literacy, and okay, it's there. So what is it? Uh, because people have this abstract idea. So the toolkit should give them some more understanding of what the concept is, and then it should also educate them on what the implications are. Um, so what kind of impact does it have for your online service, for example? So that's one important part of the toolkit. Then second, what we want to include there is a set of guidelines that developers can follow to create services that comply. And I don't think we will create a list of 100 guidelines. I think they should be short and they should be, workable. I know that developers have a lot of requirements that they should comply with. So it should also be feasible. You have to work with the requirements from your end users. Then you have your GDPR. Then you have your accessibility requirements and your privacy. And then on top also comes the e-health literacy. It becomes a bit much, so it should be short and snappy and doable. And then there's the room for creating a space for community, so sharing good practices, bad practices. I also like to learn from how not to do things. So, and I think those three aspects together, they create really a sense of community and a toolkit, and uh, I hope a bigger incentive to focus on the topic of e-health literacy.
Hmm. Mm. Is it? I mean, we're talking about fairly complex systems often. Um, can you make a guideline that's simple for something that's complex? How? I mean, I'm not suggesting that. I mean, good design
Hmm.
essentially is, of course, about making something that has a lot of complexity in it simple in a way. But in this case, we're not just talking about design; we're talking about a guideline. If
Hmm.
well, for developers, but you can talk about designers too. Um, and it seems, of course, that there's really a lot of material. There's a lot of considerations, all boiling down to 5 easy steps.
Yeah, 5 is pushing it a little bit, I think. I would be happy with 15.
Okay.
Um, I think we should strive towards easy. We I think it's the strength of such a toolkit if you can make it easy, and maybe they will not apply 100% to a specific case. It would be impossible because then you have to create guidelines for every specific type of application, of course,
Hmm.
uh, because there will be country-specific things or disease-specific things, or maybe related to a specific type of literacy. So it's impossible to create a perfect fit, but I think that we can do a general set of guidelines. And I would already be very happy if people and developers look at these guidelines and then look at their own services and start to reflect on, oh, I here have this guideline, and this is how I, for example, should deal with content. And I'm going to reflect on my own service and see whether it applies or not, or see how can I improve myself. That they become aware of the topic and have the ambition to optimize their service. I think that's already a big achievement then of the toolkit.
Hmm. Um, but for those the developers, though, I mean, before when they didn't have the guide, or well, hitherto in the work that they've done with digital development, I suppose some of them have done the best that they could to build a good product. It's sort of in their own commercial interest to build good products. One
Hmm.
one might say. Um, so, but where's sort of the areas where you think that they're still getting it wrong? I mean, they're doing the best they can. Surely,
Hmm.
surely, what's wrong with doing with clever people doing the best they can?
Hmm.
Uh, and yet you're saying that it's not good enough, or what is the also the message here?
Oh, it's a confronting
I
question,
guess I'm
Lars.
also teasing you a bit, but it's
Yeah,
interesting, of course. Um,
it is.
should this add more work to what they do, or should it make it easier for them to do what they do?
I think both, which is a
Hmm.
really difficult answer as well. Okay, there's this one strand of thought, and there's also studies backing this up, is that if people choose a new technology, they will choose it on the amount of features it has. So more features sounds like better value for money, right?
Hmm.
Then at one point they have the technology, then it shifts the importance on which they think a technology is worthwhile, because then at one point the whole usability part plays well. And actually, they would prefer to have a technology that's more usable instead of one with more features. So,
Hmm.
what I have the feeling now is that a lot of technology is being developed in terms of features, and then also with a bunch of people that are really trying to get most out of it, but maybe getting the most out of a technology is by making it simpler and by stripping it down to the bare necessities.
Hmm.
Um, so I always thought that was a very interesting phenomenon happening. More features at the beginning versus usability later on. And I also think this is a bit reflected in the development practice, that we tend to want as much as possible without thinking about how this might complicate things, and that you might want to sacrifice a feature in favor of usability, or in favor of accommodating people with different EL literacy skills.
But simplifying what you do um, with the aid of users out there, um, that might in a development stage be wonderful. But currently, as you say, that is also sort of what happens over time. That people develop fairly complex system and then they refine it into something that has maybe fewer features but a higher UI or user well adaptation or alignment maybe. But this is that sort of the same as you saying that currently in digital development they're using the market as the test phase where they should have tested before they actually hit the market. Is that also the case? So we have
Um,
we
I,
have these apps because they actually just want them to be, well, if not tested, then at least
mm,
proven by fire whether they
yeah.
work or not, and that we are living with mediocre products because somebody actually wants us to figure out the challenges for them.
Mm. So yeah,
Is
maybe
that
you're asking the wrong person. I did a PhD on user-centered design, so I always will say
Yeah,
that we
yeah.
should
But
test a lot.
I guess from the energy or the motivation to do a user-centered design, is that also because you see that there's a lot of products out there that where they have failed to actually then consider this until,
Mhm.
well, too late?
I hope, sincerely hope, that it's now 2021 that a lot of these companies are incorporating these concepts of user-centered designing, doing the user testing and the iterative design and all that type of stuff. I
Mm,
I truly hope that we have now accepted this commonly and it's common practice. Um, I I doubt whether there's a dedicated iteration based on ELF literacy. I because
what is it?
these are difficult to reach people and to
Mm,
include in your end user testing. And you might need to design a dedicated type of
mm,
end user test for those people and that gathering that type of feedback.
mm.
So that's what
But of course, that they're hard to reach. If this was drug development, that wouldn't actually count as an excuse. So I mean, it is, and of course, I'm not trying here to argue that the digital developers are I don't know, lazy, or that
Mhm,
they don't want to do it, or they have or ulterior motives or others. I mean, but because in many ways, I suppose that we're in the same boat. High quality content will appear when there's a high quality
mhm,
ecosystem enabling them to produce high quality content. I'm just trying to explore with you the
mhm,
ideas about where the challenge is really buried. I mean, the end user in a way is a sort of the innocent victim, I suppose. So it must be some of the other entities around it. Um, but and while the digital developers can, of course, use in vivo tests with the
mhm.
users as a way of trial by fire, um, are they being failed maybe by authorities? I mean, the Got-IT Toolkit is this a guideline that someone should have built a long time ago?
Um, so while the obvious answer would be yes, I don't think it would have been possible.
Hmm.
I think we talked earlier about this evolution, and I think
Yeah, the Maslowian, yeah.
we should have taken those steps
Hmm.
first in order to get here. I think that getting stuff right, like usability, was really a prerequisite to getting that stuff to getting at that point.
Hmm.
So I don't think we couldn't have done it any earlier. We shouldn't blame ourselves there. No.
Hmm. we are where we are and should appreciate just being able to actually move towards a better stage of evolution.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But speaking of hard to reach people, um, sometimes I suppose, I mean, there's actually three groups, I suppose, that might be hard to reach. The end users that are supposed to use these digital tools, um, the secondary users that are supposed to um, approve or live with them as part of their daily ecosystem of their work. Uh, and then also some authorities or politicians or others that actually needs to understand how this fits into a wider healthcare system. How easy is it then to reach? If the end users are hard to reach, is it easy to reach the developers and the decision makers?
Hmm.
Are they happy when we talk about these fundamental issues
Yeah,
related
yeah.
to the quality of what they do?
I think that's also an evolution that has been taking place. So I think that in the beginning, this software, or it's most of the time software I deal with,
Hmm.
it was made by developers and it was at the end given to end users, period. And at one point, we started to integrate the end user in the design process, and now there are different strands, and we're doing it more and more. So there's participatory design, citizen science, all those things. And at the same time, along the years, we have decided also to include stakeholders, so like doctors, nurses, secondary end users, and then at a later stage also the tertiary end users, so governments, municipalities, medical insurers, quite possibly as well. Um, I don't have a lot of problems with getting these people at the table. Actually, they are quite happy to talk if you have a new idea.
Hmm.
Um, so in that sense, I don't see a big problem there. But I think that a lot of people are not aware that they could also make or break your technology, especially if it's going to be implemented in a quite difficult and complicated reality, such as hospitals, for example. Um, I think they are willing to think along, as long as you take into account that doctors are always busy, will have to do it in the evenings, that type of stuff. Um,
Mm.
I think it's getting the people that are a bit reluctant to think along, that do not have the same privileged status that a lot of other people have, developers, for example. I think these are a bit harder to reach, and these are also the people that we actually should reach because they might have the most benefit from these services if they are designed well.
Mm.
So I think it's also an obligation that we really try to find these people and not to, we can go on and create a lot of line graphs and difficult overviews of data. And who will it serve? It will serve the people with high education. So we're
Mm.
creating this gap, and I don't think that's a fair thing to do.
Mm. So fairness. In the current evolution, then are things going? I mean, vis-a-vis fairness in the right direction? Are we
Um,
building? Are we building to? Are we, in your view, I suppose? And are we? I'm not asking you to have perfect knowledge about every process in the entire world,
mhm.
but are you thinking in general that we are indeed working towards something where we are actively reducing these inequalities?
I think we are aware that we are creating inequalities, which is, I think, a very good first step.
Mm.
Are we fixing them? That's a difficult one. I don't think.
Not yet. Maybe I'm
Not
sensing
yet.
the answer could be.
Yeah, of course, there's now the whole issue of AI that's creating a huge gap. So that's
Mhm.
one problem. It's maybe a bit. It's a topic that's too big for one Got-IT talk. You could make a whole series out of that
Yeah,
topic.
yeah, maybe though. But
Maybe version
just
2.0.
briefly
Yeah.
though, speaking of AI, and of course, for our listeners, that we mean we what we mean is artificial intelligence. Um, will that then fix it? Will the AI be able to sort of calculate the perfect user design and the perfect way to understand a specific individual user? So therefore, paradise will unfold. And quite recently, when we can just do it with AI.
No,
Is that sort of the
AI will instigate hell is the prevailing idea, I think. So
Hmm.
AI is just a bunch of algorithms basically, um, but they can create gaps and unfair situations in which they privilege one group over the other because it's built into an algorithm. And then because of applying that algorithm, the effect is ameliorated, so you create bigger. So
Hmm.
I don't think that AI is the solution. Could be, but not at this moment. And it's also not the solution for um, creating digital e-health services with
Hmm.
that cater to different skills, I
So
think.
it's not part of the solution for those two, but is it then the big bad wolf?
I think it's mainly us realizing that this is an issue and that we should pay attention to it, and then also integrating this into design processes. I think it's mainly our own attitude and our own thinking that's the biggest hurdle to take.
So maybe a combination of this is simply the next step to or layer to add to the top of our pyramid.
Hmm.
Um, but as much as we've had time to understand basic elements about the technical aspects of it,
Hmm.
um, both being improving in the quality of, let's say, website site design, for instance, that I remember back in the day how it was to design websites using HTML coding language. I don't think that you can find that many website designers these days that, well, some of them don't actually know what it is or remember how to do that. They're using other types of tools. But it's AI, and I mean, when we talk about AI as something that has all these worrisome qualities to it, is it just simply because we haven't actually gotten around to that particular evolutionary stage? In 10 years, the AI will be
Hmm.
just as using the phone or something that we all know
Hmm.
and don't really think about how it works. I
Hmm.
mean, most people use a smartphone, but do they really know how it works per se? I
Yeah.
mean, deep down.
The, the interesting thing about AI is going to be a game changer, I think. So it's quite hard to predict what will happen, of course.
Hmm.
Um,
But I'm asking you anyway.
yeah, I know. Ah, you're trying to get headlines out of me. Um, I think AI has been around for a few years now, and there's a huge amount of attention now towards fair AI.
Mhm.
There's also has been this book. I don't know if you read it, the Weapons of Mass Destruction, and it really makes very explicit how these things can go wrong. And I think this has been an eye opener. So we are aware of the problem, and we are aware that we should fix it. But on the other hand, there's still companies like Facebook, etc., who is quite hard to dictate what they should do with their algorithms. Um, so what's
And
going to
yet
happen?
we saw this week that apparently a big behemoth like Facebook can
Hmm.
can fall victim to human error,
Yeah, true. And
basic
then
human error.
Telegrams had millions of new users. So
Hmm.
yeah, it's true.
Um,
And there will be a lot of debate and I think a lot of new legislation as well. And I think that we are going towards a new reality in which we have to live with these technologies, and they can work for the good, of course. They can track down disease. They can figure out when somebody with a chronic condition has an exacerbation. So it has a lot of good purposes as well. I think
Is
I
that
would
then?
prefer my.
Yeah, sorry.
No, I
I
was going to say,
asked
I
you.
think I would prefer my MRI to be read by a computer than by a radiologist, to be honest.
Mhm.
So
Mm.
there are good things coming out of it as well.
Yeah, I mean, most people generally prefer to have the autopilot fly the plane while it's in the air.
Yeah.
And I know also from the studies about airline safety that it may not actually be a good idea to allow the pilots to actually land the plane either, because it seems
Yeah.
that's where the errors really arise. And it's maybe it's true. It's certainly in this case it's easy to point fingers at the pilots, the poor pilots. That they are actually in harm's way themselves, obviously. So they are probably doing what they can to avoid the accidents also. But what you mentioned earlier, of course, elements like health literacy, co-creation, co-design, participation is that then thinking of evolution or AI. AI is of course a move where you have a very advanced technological state where it's moving from human beings,
Hmm.
whereas the co-creation and the empowerment and the health literacy is something that moves towards the human element. Is that a natural sort of balance between a rapid and advanced technological evolution
Hmm.
that has to have the human element in it?
I think these are two very interesting developments that you see that are going a totally different direction, right? So you see more immersion of end users in technology design. So from user-centered design to participatory design to citizen science. So the citizens become part of the scientific team, collect data, interpret it. So that's
Mm.
giving more control to people like patients and citizens. And on the other hand, you have a movement in which you have this AI technology that's, getting all control away from people and at one point start to think for themselves. So at one point, you have to marry those two concepts. And then I think it's really figuring out what the values are of these end users. So, for example, patients, and making sure that these values are catered for in the AI
Mm.
technologies.
And where I mean, an AI will always be a very complex, a very high tech issue, and especially for people with low digital literacy,
Mhm.
they would not be first in line to understand the complexity of the AI. Yet, what you're also saying is that they are essential to the balance of trust, I suppose, and they have to
Mhm.
also trust it. I mean, it's
Mhm.
nice that you think that you would have your MRI read by an AI, but other people might be scared, reluctant,
Yeah, and
worried.
not just people with low EL literacy. I did a project with one of my PhD students, one on or figuring out what the cause was of low back pain for a patient. So we
Hmm.
had this computer system which asked a bunch of questions, and then there was this AI algorithm or machine learning, and it figured out what kind of risks this patient ran and what kind of treatment it should be given.
Hmm.
Perfect. And then we wanted to use it in clinical practice, but these doctors, they were like, I don't know what to do with it. So basically, what we then did in order to get it accepted is that we had this very intelligent machine learning algorithm, and we smashed it down into a decision tree where all intelligence was gone just because we had to get the doctor understand it. So it's not just people with low EL literacy that have a um, that we should cater for there. It's I think a big phenomenon where there's of course a lot of reluctance to just give away control to this computer, especially with people like clinicians who
Hmm.
would like to see everything protocolized with clear steps. And now there's a computer, yeah, it's probably this, and I can give some kind of percentage of how much I trust myself, but I can't explain to you why I came to this decision. That's
Mm.
basically what's happening. And then
But
ask you.
in addition, maybe to I have another question regarding AI just in a minute. But is some of it also just about the loss of control?
Yeah.
Is it? I mean, there's a there must be, or there would be a difference between if you had a real medical reason why you wouldn't want to do something, and then a good old human
Mm,
anxiety, fear, or again loss of control. It's I don't think necessarily, Lex, that you have to answer that one because it can be clear from the way that I'm asking the question what it might actually what the type of question, but for some of those secondary end users that we're talking about, doctors, nurses, and so on, um, um, uh, how can we then maybe bridge that challenge of them feeling that they're not losing control
mhm.
in a terms of the good old
Yeah.
story about
Yeah.
when people get married, you're not losing a daughter, you're gaining a son, or vice versa.
Mhm.
How can we make these doctors and nurses think that they're not losing stuff but they're gaining?
It's interesting that you bring this up. I think it's something that we talked about before as well, because we talked about there's of course if you think about e-health literacy now, you think about people with low literacy, difficult to read, difficult to understand visualizations, those type of issues. But you could also think about the e-health literacy of clinicians,
Hmm.
nurses. It's probably a different on a different level, but it's probably also a type of thing that they need to be educated in order to accept it and trust it and be able to work with it. I don't think that a lot of clinicians will have a fine understanding of what an AI technology can do or in their
Mm.
for their specific context. So I understand that then there's reluctant. I think it's a very interesting concept to work out as well. It's not in the current Got-IT toolkit, but it might be a nice extension to focus on professional e-health literacy. Yeah.
Mm. Um, and that I guess a sort of regarding trust, especially. I mean, trust is often a key component when we talk about using old tools, using new tools too,
Hmm.
especially when they either gather your data or they crunch your data, they hand you advice on things that you should do, or they influence choices being made. So trust here. Um, I've wondered sometimes about, especially about the AI, that I would probably agree. I wouldn't mind having my MRI read by an AI, or for that matter, other stuff being done by an AI. But I wonder whether we'll actually allow the AI to do it. I mean, relinquishing control
Hmm.
means having to trust not my trust, but the system's trust, the politicians' trust. Maybe. What if the AI said, you should change the policy? What's the difference between the AI saying you should change the policy and I don't know, 100 researchers saying
Hmm.
that's actually a challenge with climate change and you should change policy? Oh, sorry, that's a different discussion. But I guess my point is the same. Sometimes when you have intelligence giving you good advice,
Hmm.
it's not always that we humans follow that advice.
True. Yeah,
So
but
if
I
we
think
allow
that
it.
there are of course different, levels of giving away control. I don't think we're
Hmm,
going to say tomorrow the AI is going to read your MRI and now
here's the key to
re-
my car and my house
yeah,
and so
yeah,
on. Yeah.
yeah, and you're fired because we don't need you anymore. No,
Yeah.
but I think they of course will do it together in the beginning.
Hmm.
but I think there are definitely medical professions that can be outsourced to a computer in a few decades' time.
Mm, mm.
Yeah.
Speaking of, you mentioned training of doctors and healthcare professionals. Are we then talking about a massive return to the good old school drawing
Hmm.
board? Is this what should be the format here?
Hmm.
Should we think about how is this solved sort of at the source by changing the medical education at the
Hmm.
sort of a basic training, or how do we retool
Hmm.
uh, current both at the same time, or
I've asked this question to several healthcare professionals, at least in the Netherlands. I don't know how it is for the other countries. And I
Mhm,
asked them, so what kind of education do you get on e-health during your 6 years of studies in medicine?
mhm. None? Yeah.
None.
Mm,
So I think it might be a nice start there, getting some introductory courses to get them a bit of knowledge on the topic, a bit of feeling, and then I think that would be a very nice start.
mhm. To include that somehow.
Yeah.
Um, are you thinking? I mean, when we've not necessarily when we talked about the balance between AI or co-creation or empowerment and health literacy, but specifically maybe about the co-creation, empowerment, and health literacy. Are you feeling that even though what you've already said, of course, that you feel that this is a natural evolution that we should head towards. But are you feeling that it's sort of easy supported? Are you feeling that you can really see how a lot of investment money is going into this area, or is this something that where the investments mirror all the positive
Hmm.
speeches?
So you're asking me whether it's becoming easier to have a say as a
Or
patient.
maybe um, sometimes when we have debates about specifically sustainability, there seems to be a difference between how many that are saying that they're really
Hmm.
passionate about sustainability and that they're working with sustainability, and then the progress being made or the
Hmm.
investment that you see. So are you seeing sort of a similar dissonance between a lot of people saying, "Oh, co-creation, empowerment, health literacy, we really, really like that,"
Hmm.
but are they either the I don't know, the nation states or the big organizations? Are you seeing that there's a balance between how much they praise this issue and how they actually then also act?
I think so. If I look at the grants um, that countries give out, or that the European Commission gives out for developing these type of new technologies, they're all about including end users and citizen science and that type of stuff. So I think on the one hand that's happening, and on
Hmm.
the other hand there are now also the tools for people like patients to gather and do stuff. So you had patients like me for I think a decade now,
Hmm.
and they allow people to unite and to come up with their own research question and to do a study themselves or to come up with a new technology. So I do think that the development of these new technologies, it's not solely something that universities can do or companies can do, but I think that we will also see more and more innovations coming from patients themselves. And innovations could be treatments, technological innovations, or just new insights in diseases. And I think that this will become such a common practice that it will really take up a space in how we do this type of stuff. So I
Hmm.
think that it's not something that has to be facilitated by governments only, but it's also something that patients and citizens will demand at one time, and they will just take. the opportunity instead of wait for it.
So would it be fair to describe you in this particular area as a very happy optimist?
I think so. I think one should be an optimist to work in this field, right? It makes
Hmm.
life a lot easier, I think. But I'm a person that embraces change and innovation, always trying to see what's happening and what's good and what's bad. But yeah, I think this is a positive thing that's happening. Yeah.
But maybe though, still, what's bad? Are there elements that you're either thinking, ah, God damn it, that's moving in the wrong direction, or
Mm,
where you're mindful of particular challenges? I'm in health research in general,
mm,
and specifically for health data, a huge debate, of course, has been around the GDPR and how that places a lot of challenges for the researchers, but also, of course, for anyone working with health data and how to do certain stuff. Um, uh, and I am not trying to advocate here that concerns about data privacy is just
mm,
ludicrous and we should just be allowed to do everything we wanted to do. Um, Yet, for some, the GDPR has something that worries them, that they'll not be able to actually do the research they want to do, not be able to deliver the personalized medicine that they want
mm,
to, and so on. While that not might not be a fear or a worry that you have, but if we're talking about the bad, the worries, what would you describe as some of the
mm.
uh, things that you're mindful of? We still have sort of to really figure out how to do.
Yeah. What concerns me a bit is that we see all these directions all these changes going in the direction of giving patients and citizens more and more control, which I'm not
Mhm.
against, but it also makes it sound like a technology push is a bad word, something dirty,
Mhm.
because the patients were not involved. So how can it ever be good? Because you have to consult the patients, right?
Mhm.
I don't think a technology push is necessarily a bad thing. So what I'm afraid for is that we are focusing on the good of the new while not recognizing that it was also good in what we did in the past, of course. I'm not saying that we should never listen to patients anymore, but I'm just saying that it might not be such a bad idea once in a while to try something totally new that's not what immediately embraced by patients because it's maybe too disruptive. That's not necessarily a bad thing.
Mm.
So
We're essentially talking about good old stories like the Beatles not being recognized by the record label because they're unable to actually see the
yeah,
future
yeah, yeah,
presenting themselves and so on.
yeah.
Yeah.
The record label
Um,
hating Bohemian Rhapsody. Yeah, yeah.
hmm, hmm. Um, is that though? Is that part of I guess human nature? I mean, we have to suffer these um, um, mistakes.
I think it's part of the deal. I think one should accept in developing these innovations that you will do things wrong. That's just
Hmm.
part of what it is. I think it's a trajectory you learn, and you cannot do it right at once, and you should allow yourself space to fail somewhere or the other.
Hmm.
It's also maybe a bit of a difference between cultures. I know that in the US, it's widely accepted that if you do a startup that you fail because most startups fail. In the Netherlands, it's really seen as something bad if you fail with your company. But I think in the US, it's more of a badge of honor. I think it's good if we also give ourselves this room to fail and to learn from that.
To learn from our failures.
Yeah.
Indeed. Um, It's been a pleasure talking to you, Lex, on
Likewise.
digital development and on the Got-IT guideline and the potential there. And I look forward to learning more about the evolution, both of the guideline and of digital tools in general. Thank you.
You're welcome.